Welcome to the Outthinking Investor. Today, I'm joined by Chris Hughes, a name many people first came to know as a co-founder of Facebook, but that was only the beginning of his story. Chris is also an economist working towards his PhD at Wharton. He's a policy advocate who co-founded the Economic Security Project, and he's a writer, the author of Fair Shot, Marketcrafters, and soon a third book about the Fed, how its operating framework shapes who wins and who loses from monetary policy in America. And I'll tell you, Chris, that selfishly, you've been near the top of my wish list of guests because the core argument of market crafters, that markets don't emerge naturally or operate neutrally, it just rings so true to my own experience in government and markets. So thanks very much for joining and welcome to the show.
Yeah, of course. Well, I love that. That's a nice way to kick us off.
Well, and I actually want to start with your origin story, just so everyone understands where you're coming from. I mean, as I mentioned, you co-founded Facebook at Harvard. You left the company within a year after graduating. And since then, I would say your professional focus has been on policy. Correct me if you think that's wrong, but if it's correct, why the pivot?
I think that's generally right. We started Facebook in February of 2004, and I ended up leaving in around February of 2007 to go work for Barack Obama in that insurgent 2008 campaign, which was, to be honest, as transformative for me personally as the beginning days of Facebook was. But then in the 20 years since then, for a few years I wandered about, to be honest. I didn't really, I had a lot of opportunity. I had more wealth than I could have ever dreamed of. I'd grown up in a small town in North Carolina, and my dad was a traveling paper salesman. My mom was a high school teacher. Then Facebook happens, explodes, and it transforms my life. So it took me a minute to figure out, to be honest, what I wanted to do professionally and who I was because of all these early career successes. But then about 10 years ago, I found myself increasingly obsessed with economics and political economy more broadly, initially with an activist kind of philanthropic bent, but then it was really the ideas and the theory that hooked me. And so for the past 10 years, I've been reading, writing. I'm trying to develop ideas and to do it in a way that isn't just, in the academy, talking to the academy, but also can hopefully have a policy impact in the world.
I didn't know that you're from North Carolina. I'm from Raleigh. Where are you from?
Hickory.
Oh, right. I know Hickory. Played tennis tournaments there.
Oh, really? I also played tennis tournaments there. And Raleigh. No, I don't know about that. But my parents, I was born in Hickory, and my parents still live there in Wilmington, actually.
Okay. Well, look, I mean, that personal journey, it kind of leads directly to the argument at the center of market crafters, which is where I want to dwell. I mean, you reject the idea that markets just happen naturally, like the weather. And you say they're almost always shaped by policy choices, actions and inactions. Can you flesh that out for us?
Yeah, when I was in college at Harvard, I took an economics class, and I hated it. It was one of the hardest classes that I took.
Who was the professor?
It wasn't the Ec 10 class that a lot of your listeners may know and that Jason Furman now teaches and Greg Mankiw taught before this. This was like a lefty Ec 10. It was taught by Stephen Margolin, who was what we call a heterodox economist thinker. And he tried to jam effectively a full year's worth of curriculum into a single semester. And even with that kind of, let's call it, creative thinking in economics, I still just couldn't get past the first chapter. The idea that we have to make these basic assumptions about perfect information and pursuit of value maximization to create a model and think about the world just never really resonated with me. And so as an adult, I've come back to economics and think of myself now as an economist. And so I love it as a field. But one of the reasons that I was able to do that is because I figured out that there are actually other traditions in economics which don't pull from the same kind of neoclassical paradigm, but instead put the role of institutions front and center. And the basic argument is that before you talk about markets working a certain way in theory, we have to think about the lived reality of how markets actually exist. And they are mediated by a whole set of institutions. Many of them are from the private sector firms themselves. Some are public institutions. There's educational institutions, labor institutions, et cetera. So the argument of market crafters is that most markets, well over half of the American economy, is really managed and shaped by the state. So I'm trying to make a lot of room to embrace, the private impulses of capitalism. The innovation is clear and real, and we often create a sandbox around it with boundaries so that it works for the public good. And so you can see that certainly in banking and finance, but look at airlines or health insurance or pharmaceuticals or even automobiles. We can go through a long list, certainly semiconductors and all kinds of things that I think we'll talk about, of industries that are shaped and managed by the state. And I think what I was trying to do in the Market Crafters project was sort of tell this alternative history of the past 100 years of American capitalism, and one that, is full of successes and also failures. It's not that it's good or bad for the state to be managing markets. It depends on what the goal is and how effective the work is. But the thing that we can't do is pretend that markets are just sort of freely functioning in a self-regulating way out there, and then every now and then the state comes in and quote unquote intervenes. That language,
so you're
the language that's toxic.
The word intervention, it's kind of a trigger for you.
Yeah, it drives me nuts. It drives me nuts because it implies that the river just runs and until the state comes in and then comes out.
Okay, so send electric shocks my way if I mistakenly use the term.
I mean, I use it all the time though. It's not
we all do.
It's a natural thing. It's baked into our language and our conceptual.
Yeah. And so your preferred conceptual frame is this market crafting concept that policymakers are guiding and managing markets towards some political goal, making Americans richer or safer or less unequal all the time. And you make the case that at least over the last 100 years, probably well beyond that, market crafting has been taking place from Republicans and Democrats alike. In fact, I think many of the most consequential episodes you profile happened under Republican presidents. So maybe take us back to Jesse Jones. Most people don't realize that the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, arguably one of the most successful examples of market crafting in American history, started under Hoover, not FDR. So tell us his story.
Jesse Jones was a larger-than-life figure, and the reason that I start the book with him is because we live in this moment now, today, where there's so much interest in a sovereign wealth fund or a national investment bank and in public finance, and a lot of the time we think that this is a new concept in American history, and I wanted to ground Market Crafters as a book in the story of the National Investment Bank that we had here in the United States, created by a Republican, Herbert Hoover, but meaningfully expanded by Roosevelt and Democrats, but a national investment bank that existed for about 20 years, a little bit more than 20 years. And
so early 1930s until about the mid-1950s, Chris?
Exactly. It was wound down in 1952 and was started at the end of the Hoover administration, I believe, in 1931. It might have been 1930. But it was an extremely important institution in the Depression years and then later in the war. In fact, its first major mandate was to stabilize the financial and banking sector. The Fed really struggled, certainly in 1929 at the beginning of the crisis that ignited the Great Depression, but in the years following. And Roosevelt when he becomes president, his first move is to declare a bank holiday. I won't take you through all the details of exactly that moment, but the upshot is that it was the Reconstruction Finance Corporation that was recapitalizing a lot of these institutions, working in conjunction with the Federal Reserve banks, but really in the driver's seat for much of it. In a second phase, it does a lot of work around housing in particular and trying to build new markets. And then the third is...
That was Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac.
Exactly.
Those are the main institutions that were supporting housing.
Exactly. And at the tail end of the 1930s, and of course, still exist today. And then the real explosion of size was leading up into the war. Even before Congress declares war on Japan and Germany, you can see that war is on the horizon and coming. And Roosevelt and Jones were able to make really meaningful investments in all kinds of industries, certainly aeronautics and aerospace, but also things like rubber and aluminum, the kinds of things that you really needed a robust supply chain for in order to be able to move quickly when you declared war, to build all those tanks and to build all those planes and to build all those bombs. So the point that the upshot of the Jesse Jones and RFC story, though, isn't that like it was this institution that was making all these industries work single-handedly. It was bringing public capital, public investment to bear to work as a magnet, to bring a lot of the private sector into these industries that would have otherwise not have been as supported. So it was more guiding and managing these markets than it was creating them out of thin air. And so I like it as an example because it's sort of like a dance partner, I think, is one analogy that sometimes I play with. Like, you need the private sector innovation to make these industries possible. You want the banks originating mortgage loans, of course, but then you want the state to say, you know what, it would be a lot easier to originate a lot more mortgages if we had a really efficient secondary market for those so that folks in New York could finance a single-family home in Colorado. And let's create that market and make it easier so that we can achieve this public goal of having more and cheaper housing.
I like the way you're describing the kind of the rhythm that was established between the government and the private sector, because some of our listeners might hear this conversation and say market crafting is just central planning or state capitalism by another name. So explain the difference, and if you have something in mind, what's the dividing line between the two?
I hear that, and I hear that concern. But when market crafting is successful, what happens is the state identifies a goal, which it might be housing construction, or it might be energy stability, or it might be making semiconductors here at home. So it has a clear goal, and then it brings a host of tools to bear. It could be direct investment, it could be subsidies, it could be guarantees, it could be stockpiling. We could go through the tools that are available in order to meet that goal. But rarely is it central planning, and in fact, I looked very hard for examples of central planning in American history, and I couldn't find any. In the sense of, like, we want this amount of output, we want these particular firms to be the ones doing it, we're going to hold them to these particular benchmarks. That kind of sort of puppeteering doesn't exist.
In other words,
and I don't think
scenarios in which a government official sets quantities and prices by fiat and destroys price discovery and information flows that the price system generates. That you don't see any precedent for that.
I don't see that anywhere. And to use another analogy, I feel like markets, you can think of them almost as sort of rambunctious kids at a playground. If it's very difficult, if not impossible, to tell a 5-year-old, hey, you're going to go swing on that swing over there for this many minutes, and you're going to have this much fun, and then you're going to come right back here. And no, You can't do
You
that.
have young kids.
Right. But you can make the decision to bring the kids to the playground to say,
Yes.
hey, we're going to be here for 20 minutes. Best of luck. Go run around. Or, oh, look, this swing is interesting. You see what I'm saying? Like the markets are dynamic and creative at their heart, and they can't be planned and they shouldn't be planned, but they can be guided.
Let me press you a little bit because I find this part of the discussion fascinating on industrial policy. And I know we're talking about a concept that's broader, but at what point would you say, Chris, that a subsidy or a guarantee, or let's say a price floor, becomes de facto price setting? Like, can you think of a clean test for whether policymakers are actively shaping and nurturing competition or suppressing it?
Um, I think that, I mean, prices can be chosen and are chosen by the government. I mean, we select the price of short term credit and celebrate that as a major advance in economic management. And people on the right or the left agree with that as a method of monetary policy implementation. They might disagree about whether the price is correct or not. Often they do. But so price selection can happen and can be helpful. But I think it is even there very bounded. And of course, you can uh, select the price of short term credit, but I and many other folks who study monetary policy get a lot more nervous when you begin to talk about yield curve design and think about medium term and the longer term. So price floors and price ceilings, I think, are really elegant solutions for buffering, particularly for essential goods. Again, back to the Depression, we did this. The RFC did this. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation that we were just talking about did this, but so did the Commodity Credit Corporation and others with a whole host of goods, cotton, butter, grapes, wheat, etc., in order to say, hey, we want prices to be stable, and we don't want to go through a boom and bust cycle for the things that are critical for both producers and consumers. And I think that kind of stability can be very generative. It certainly is. The idea of price stability is that it is generative and increases the confidence of investors, thereby increasing the amount of investment capital. And so the same thing can be true in other industries as well.
Yeah, I have to say, I mean, when I was in government, I was pushing for institutions like a strategic resilience reserve that reimagines the strategic petroleum reserve or a strategic investment fund that are designed to expand productive capacity driven by the private sector or reduce choke point risk or attack inflation at its source on the supply side. These are challenges that monetary policy struggles to address. So I'll come back to that because I want to ask you about, potentially some new institutions that belong in the current moment. But I actually want to go back to the title of your book. I mean, you called it Market Crafters and not Market Crafting, which suggests that people and personalities matter.
A lot.
What was it about? If you want to use Jesse Jones as an exemplar, fine, or maybe somebody else from the book. But what's the difference between someone who is successful and someone like Arthur Burns, who also shows up in your book? As someone who had a lot of ideas about how to deal with inflation in the early 1970s, but ultimately was unsuccessful in pushing forward a broader supply side agenda.
Well, as I was moving through the history, I kept stumbling across these characters. And at least for me, it made the research a lot more fun to think about these historical moments through the eyes of these individuals. And so the more that I spent time with them, the more that I came to really appreciate the role of leadership and having the right individual at the helm of the right institution can make all the difference. And so the way that I organized the book was around these dozen different market crafters, these individuals who wanted to guide markets toward a certain end. And the last third of the book is contemporary, so over the past 10 to 15 years. And one of the people that I focus quite a bit on is Lena Khan, who obviously was the chair of the FTC in the Biden administration. And, I think that in her story, you can love the work that she did. You can be critical of the work that she did, but it's very hard to downplay it or say that it didn't matter because of the vision that she had for not just making more markets in the United States more competitive, but using the FTC and a lot of authorities and a lot of powers that had not been used in generations, reigniting those and doing it in a pretty aggressive fashion that made the work of the FTC more relevant than ever. And so when you find those individuals who have that vision and who are ready to go and sort of wield the institutional power of the state, a lot can happen. The other folks I spend a lot of time on in the book from the contemporary world are your former colleagues, Brian Deese and Mike Schmidt, and using some of the examples of the CHIPS Act in particular as another powerful example of an institution that, because it got leaders that were able to pursue its agenda aggressively, it was quite successful. And I think you see that even now in the Trump administration's continuation of a lot of those policies, even if they are taking a different shape.
Mike was the most recent guest on this show, so
Great.
I certainly agree. I'm a big fan. And, let me ask you this. If outcomes hinge, at least in part, on individuals, then the policy recommendations that flow out of a market crafting agenda, are they strictly about policy? Because you can't legislate a Mike Schmidt. You get whoever the presidential appointment process delivers, and there is discretion. So I guess maybe my real question is, what are the institutional guardrails that survive a wave of policymakers who, let's just take an adverse scenario, who are serving for all the wrong reasons? I thought about this a lot when considering whether and how we could implement a strategic or sovereign wealth fund.
Mhm. Yeah. So I generally think that institutions that have a clear mandate and have meaningful discretion in implementing that mandate and then have accountability, those are the right three ingredients to set it up for success. So let's
Can you
use
say it again, Chris? What were the three?
have a clear mandate, so a clear goal, a meaningful amount of discretion in accomplishing that goal, and then accountability, often from Congress, although not exclusively, to ensure that they do. So maybe we can use two examples here if we have the time. The first is the CHIPS Act. So there's $40 billion, and the Commerce Secretary has a goal to reshore chips production, and then it's up to her to build a team and an institution to do that, figure out exactly how to do that, and then run with it. And of course, it's up to Congress to make sure that they're appropriating those funds in a way that is in the courts that is consistent with Congress's prerogative. The same thing is true about the Fed. The Fed has, since the late 1970s, has a clear mandate of price stability, maximum employment, and in the law, moderate long-term interest rates. The Fed's also read into it a mandate for financial stability. But what the Fed's goal is what I'm trying to say. Like, what the FOMC is focused on. When they fail. But they have pretty wide discretion to figure out, what does price stability mean? What is it not? What is maximum employment? What even are moderate long-term interest? So they have definitional discretion, and then they have discretion to figure out exactly how they want to get from point A to point B. Of course, the law requires the chair to testify every quarter, and so Congress holds an account in that way. And if Congress doesn't like the way, for instance, they're implementing monetary policy, they can change it. They have
And it
before.
has been changed, I think over 200 times since 1913.
Oh, yeah. The Fed is constantly being sort of rejiggered, or the Fed's constantly being, updated by Congress, and sometimes in ways that would strike many people as being a bit as managing things in a micro kind of way. So, but I think at the point I'm trying to make is I think the most effective institutions in economic governance and in marketcraft have these big missions, have meaningful discretion to accomplish them, and then get held accountable on an ongoing basis.
So let me fast forward from 2022 to the present, and let's again stipulate that market crafting is all about guiding and shaping markets to achieve a political goal. So for any political incumbent in almost any advanced economy right now, no objective is more important than reducing the cost of living. I know you're not an elected official, nor are you seeking to become an elected official, at least not immediately. But what would a market crafting agenda involve to help reduce prices or at least temper inflation in the most inflationary categories? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. I think you need to go category by category and think about how the existing market structure is inflating prices for consumers. So maybe we can spend a minute with housing because it is the single most important expense in the budgets of American households. And it has gone up precipitously in the past 5 years. And we have shaped that market in the sense that we have a mortgage product that is specific to the American context of 30 years. The government has shaped a secondary mortgage market. We have made it so that there's tax advantages to ownership. The Fed has subsidized the cost of mortgages through its decision to buy mortgage-backed securities now almost 20 years ago and continue to hold them. At its peak, it held 40% of the outstanding mortgage-backed securities that exist. So and this is all not to say anything of the local market organization when it comes to things like zoning, which has been very important. So I think when it comes to housing, there are a lot of things that we can think about. Recently, I put together a report with Aaron Klein that we published at Brookings that imagined transitioning the federal home loan banks, which are a holdover from the Great Depression, which as institutions have sort of lost their way and don't really subsidize housing construction, but thinking about updating them so that they are effectively a national housing investment bank that could make it a lot cheaper to build sort of small to mid-sized apartment buildings, the kinds of apartment buildings that create the starter apartments that a lot of Americans need, between 5 and 50 units. So not the big high rises, but not the single family ones either. That could meaningfully lower the price for developers, igniting a lot of supply, stabilizing prices, if not even bringing them down. You could make public investments in modular. You could have, if we did have a national investment bank today, you could think about how the different pieces of modular housing, this is the kind of housing that's built off-site and then is brought on-site, and you can watch it. It's sort of like Jenga blocks or something going up. Buildings can be built in the course of weeks, let alone months.
And what's holding back? One hears about modular housing quite a bit, especially when you're in abundance circles, those who've read the book and are fans of it. But what's holding it back? Why isn't it more prominent already?
There's a lot. Standards are a big thing because, the size of a wall or what's required for a pipe fitting vary meaningfully from local area to local area. So standardization of standards. The cost of transporting the goods, you need to have a somewhat dense network of these things with enough demand to make the math work. The difficulty of borrowing to finance the purchase of a modular home because of some antiquated regulations. They don't always qualify for the same 30-year kind of mortgage that a traditional home would. So there's no like one sort of magical solution for modular. There's a few things you have to get right. And that's why, to go back just to make reference to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, that's why you need a clear vision. Hey, make housing cheaper by making modular more popular. And then you need to have enough discretion that experts can figure out, okay, we need to change these regulations. We need to ensure there's enough financing here. Maybe we should focus manufacturing in a particularly ripe region where the cost of distribution will be lower. You need to be able to have a cook in the kitchen who can coordinate all these different inputs.
You're
To
almost
make it
describing like a comprehensive industrial policy for housing that touches on financing, regulation,
yeah.
achieving scale,
But it has
all
to
of those
have a
components.
single home. My biggest fear is the balkanization, right? So it's when everybody's responsible for it, and no one's responsible for it, that I think you get real problems. And so the healthcare system in the United States, I think, is a very good example of failed market craft in that way.
So this cost of living discussion, it points to I think a broader challenge of how policy can shape markets when there are scarce inputs and concentrated power without being captured. I'm really talking about AI
Hmm.
because the potential policy levers are everywhere. We know that antitrust, taxation, energy permitting, immigration policy, export controls, equity stakes, subsidies, blah blah blah. But my question to you, Chris, and it's particularly relevant given where your career started. I mean, do you think the state is crafting the market for AI with deliberate design, or is it more like the market's crafting policy at the moment?
I don't think that there is a state policy toward AI in general right now. I think we don't know what it should be or whether we need it. And so I think it's more important to develop a kind of political consensus around what we want AI to do for us as a people, as a society, than to rush to regulate it just for the sake of regulating it. I think AI, as much as it feels like it is just omnipresent at this point, I mean, you can't open whether it's a podcast or the newspaper or have a conversation with folks without talking about AI. It's still nascent. And I think Americans are still trying to figure out, how do we want to use it in our lives, in our personal lives, at work, as we move through the world. And so I don't think we have a market craft yet for it. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is, I think that that's okay. Like, I certainly don't think we need any more public subsidies to say, hey, we need more AI. I mean, good Lord, the amount of investment capital that has just rushed into the field, I think gives me pause. I think it should give us all pause as potential investment cycles. So we don't need that. I think we do need more regulation along the lines of what California and New York have done from a safety perspective. I think we need a clear sense of liability to ensure that these companies are not carved out from liability like a lot of the social media companies are. But I'm cautiously optimistic about that. So we have lots of needs with AI. But in terms of market craft, I think it's too early.
Okay. So I'll come back to you on that at some future date. And I want to close the conversation with your next book, which is about the Fed. So let's maybe contrast that with AI. If AI is the question is whether the state can and should shape a fast-moving private market without being captured by it. I would say the Fed is almost like the mirror image. It's an institution that, you mentioned this before, extraordinary public power to administer the overnight risk-free rate upon which the entire yield curve is bootstrapped and every cash flow producing asset is discounted. And I mean, I think you've alluded to in one of your papers, the Fed is maybe the most pure market crafter in the economy. But you really have a critique of the way in which its operating system, its plumbing, has been conducted because it does create winners and losers. There are distributional consequences, and it's not clear who made those choices. So tell us, again, if I mischaracterized, correct me, but tell us where you're going.
Well, the book that I am working on now is a story. Is really a story of how the Fed, as an institution, makes decisions about what are admittedly technical topics that have a huge impact on financial markets and the lives of everyday Americans. So this project began with a different obsession, an obsession with the plumbing of Fed policy, because it is often seen as technical. Many people assume it's beyond politics, and that's not right. So the Fed uses an operating system called ample reserves to implement monetary policy. And the basic idea is that all of those open market operations that probably many of your listeners were taught about in their own economics
obsess over-
classes, yeah, we don't do
Yes.
those. We don't do those anymore, right? So they are still taught in the textbooks, but that's actually not how monetary policy is implemented. It's not through um, buying or selling of assets. Instead, it's through a set of administered rates. So the Fed actually pays banks interest on their reserves. Reserves are the deposits of commercial banks that sit at the Fed. And along with a couple other facilities, it uses that interest rate to control the short-term rate. This was an idea that had a lot of folks interested in it for much of the 20th century, but it was so politically toxic that it never happened. And it took decades of Fed advocacy for it to even become legally possible to do this in 2006. And then in the wake of the great financial crisis, these tools were adopted. I don't have anything against the tools in and of themselves, but the point of the book and the project is that they have really meaningful side effects that I think we should be much more aware of. They subsidize bank equity holders in a way that I think most taxpayers should be upset about. They shift debt management and decisions to the Fed instead of the Treasury. They pursue credit allocation, particularly in housing markets. They distort market pricing by holding too many securities, particularly at the long end of the yield curve. And I think finally they encourage a real politicization of the Fed. We've seen an explosion of interest in all kinds of creative ideas for what the Fed can become. And I guess despite my politics, I'm a little conservative on the role that the Fed should be having. And I think it should be focused on monetary policy, not financing the energy transition. And I think that creativity is partially a result of the large balance sheet that the current system requires.
So I just want to repeat at least part of the argument that you're making. And I think the paper you wrote with Josh Younger, Price of the Floor, lays this out. But you're really saying the ample reserves regime provides banks two main benefits. One is there's, let's call it incremental deposit franchise value because they receive interest on their reserves and it's funded by deposits that pays well below the risk-free rate. And also there's kind of this uncompensated maturity transformation benefit because the New York Fed, with their SOMA portfolio, warehouses the mark-to-market risk that would otherwise sit on private balance sheets.
Mm-hmm.
Am I characterizing your argument? Okay,
yeah,
and let me try to quantify them.
Let me try to break it down so it's simpler and so we don't lose every single listener by hitting the
some
pause.
people will get this
some
very
people
well,
will
and others
be
will not at
experts,
all.
and some less so. So, if you're Bank of America, you can make 3.5%. In fact, you do make 3.5% on your reserves that you park at the Fed overnight. And you pay your depositors, if it's a wholesale depositor, probably somewhere around 60 cents on the dollar, right? So you pay them, somewhere in the high ones. The delta between that, you pocket. You don't do that on all deposits, not the 20-some trillion deposits that are in the commercial banking system. We're just talking about the $3 trillion of reserves that QE specifically created So before the financial crisis, we had about $10 billion of reserves. Now it's over 3 trillion. So that explosion of reserves happened through QE and for a lot of different reasons, regulatory reasons, liquidity ratio, et cetera. But the upshot is that the design of the system now requires a floor of $3 trillion. In fact, the Fed cannot go below it or their whole system breaks. So right now, they are expanding the balance sheet, even though rates are high, which feels very counterintuitive for anybody who studied monetary policy before this regime, because why would you be injecting liquidity if you're trying to hold rates high? It's because you have to in the name of financial stability. And so the system has really meaningful.
The long shadow of September 2019.
Yeah, and this is just one of the side effects of the of the major problems of it, but it's a real one.
Okay, so your paper it sort of critiques the current regime and kind of argues for a leaner footprint, but it stops short of prescribing a replacement. Do you have an alternate regime in mind? I mean, do you want to go back to a corridor system, or you just want to make the reserves regime less ample? Or do you want to tier the remuneration of reserves so that not everything earns interest? I'm just curious, where would you go if you were on Chair Warsh's task force?
What we need is an elastic reserve system that relies on the demand from the private sector to furnish enough reserves for the system to remain stable and no more. When paired with other policies, well, exactly. I'll say when paired with other policies that reduce reserve demand, you could take the balance sheet down really meaningfully. You could potentially operate with $1 trillion of reserves at the minimum. So how do you know what is enough? You provide reserves in the system, and then as you're draining, banks need liquidity. And so first they turn to private markets for the liquidity, but in order to keep the rates, the short-term rates in the band, the marginal reserve provision becomes a Fed facility. So let's use a specific example. The Bank of England transitioned to a system that's similar to this a couple years ago. And so they have what they call bank rate, their target rate. But as they drain reserves from the system, as reserves grow more scarce, rates can spike, right? And so then the concern is, oh goodness, you don't want rates to exit your policy vicinity. So what do? Well, you provide rates cheaply at a central bank's facility to those banks who need it. So they pull on it to meet their liquidity requirements, but then they naturally extinguish when the demand fades. And so it's an elastic system that's responsive to demand. You could call it a demand-driven reserve system is another term of art. But the key idea is that instead of requiring the Fed to estimate overall demand in the system and to keep a high floor, it enables the floor to go down until the amount of reserves it really does run the risk of going too low, and then it stabilizes because the facilities are standing facilities available to anyone at any time.
So rather than pretend that Fed policymakers have omnipotence, let market-based indicators inform you as to where the kind of Goldilocks zone of reserve should settle.
Yeah, and you have to pair this with changes, I think, to the liquidity requirements, changes to the payment system, backing the Treasury's deposit account at the Fed with bills, and all of these other policies cause that floor to go down and to continue to go down. And then elasticity enables it to be less sclerotic and more responsive to what markets need.
Well, that's a great teaser for the forthcoming book. When does that come out?
Well, it has to get finished first. So we're looking at about 18 months, but I'm going to do a couple papers with Brookings along the way. So,
okay, we'll look forward to that. Excellent. Sure. Look, Chris, you've been generous with your time. We've spent 45 minutes covering a lot of ground, industrial policy, AI, the Fed balance sheet. These are topics that don't normally belong in the same conversation, but thank you for your range. I just want to ask one last question I ask everybody, um, which is, what is the kind of one belief that's widely held in your world? Maybe you'd say the policy world, that you think is just flat wrong.
Mhm. I think that there is an idea that we either have to be for abundance kind of supply side policies that can craft markets to create more wealth, or we can be sort of lefty crusaders, the anti-monopoly, sort of anti-corporate folks. Um, and I don't think that those are mutually exclusive.
That's a great place to leave it. Chris Hughes, thanks very much for joining me. And
Thanks for
I wish you a smooth ride into the end of summer.
likewise.
Past performance is not a guarantee of future results. Views and opinions expressed may not reflect PGIMS and are subject to change. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended as investment advice. References to specific companies are for illustrative purposes only and should not be interpreted as recommendations to purchase or sell securities. PGIM and its affiliates may hold positions in the securities of companies referenced herein. This is not a solicitation. Please visit pgim.com for important disclosures and additional information, including details on non-U.S. jurisdictions. Prudential Financial Inc. of the United States is not affiliated in any manner with Prudential plc, incorporated in the United Kingdom, or with Prudential Assurance Company, a subsidiary of M&G plc, incorporated in the United Kingdom. Copyright 2026 Prudential Financial Inc. and its related entities. Prudential, PGIM, the Prudential logo, and the rock symbol are service marks of PFI and its related entities, registered in many jurisdictions worldwide.